No, you've got to be very careful.
I've actually said that. As soon as I need to pay someone, it's for a high price. There's that cheap person. You come with.
Oh, okay.
No.
On Monday. Oh, all right. I'm going to do something.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm giving a presentation. I'm going to do that. How you doing, man? How's it going?
Really good.
How you enjoying being
Yeah.
It's good brand news. What it is. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm like, you're in a bit of it. Right? Like, you know, in a bad year, you're
Enough attention for the race.
They've problem here for councils. They've spent a lot of money and rates are really high and they don't necessarily spend on it. Yeah, so that's their challenge at the moment. You know how many rates are? Oh, okay. When did you sell?
Thank you. Yeah.
No pressure. Maybe I'll give you a job you know.
Another day, another presentation.
Good to see you. Thanks, everyone. If you could just take your seats and we'll be underway in a minute or two.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to get up. No, I've got to go over here. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. Sorry. You normally be standing. We'll need a time at I'm not sure what your big issues, but relative to the Like reaching out to them because they're not out there, right? That makes sense. Cumulative planning sometimes in a cabinet size too, depending on the level of
My generation used to get out well, you see that was the treasury, the association, they were like population, but then you see that people were isolating themselves. Not today.
Sorry. Probably should keep going. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very serious. I believe it also. You remember, yeah. It's hard to
Reminds me when I first started my degree.
All right. Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name's Stuart Donovan. Thank you for coming along. I'm sure there'll be a few people still joining online, but we'll get underway. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this public policy seminar on the connection between public housing and wellbeing. If you're not here for that seminar, then you probably want to leave now and find out where you're meant to be. Just by way of background, I'm a senior fellow at Motu, and I am now based in Wellington, just having moved back here from about a decade living overseas. And for those of you who haven't attended one of these seminars before, is there anyone brave enough to put up their hand? Is anyone first seminar? Okay, good. I'll give you a bit of a background to why we're here, apart from the delicious food and the lovely company. So the aim of Motu Research is to provide decision makers in New Zealand with evidence that's relevant to policy. And hopefully you'll see that theme come through in the talks today. Fair to say our work's highly influential. We're ranked as Aotearoa's leading research organisation, economics research organisation, and our work often informs many areas of government policy, we're pleased to say. We are growing and hiring, so we have capacity for more work. And we're keen to help policymakers in New Zealand and provide you with independent evidence-based research. So please get in touch if you have challenges or questions or ideas that you're grappling with. You can reach us through our website. We are based on Cuba Street and very happy to meet for a coffee. Probably too happy, actually. That's what addiction does to you, right? But so please get in touch so that we can have a coffee with you. One of our core aims, we're not for profit. One of our core aims is to build capacity in economic and public policy research in New Zealand. So on that note, I'd just like to ask you to please join me in congratulating the recent winner of our Sir Frank Holmes Scholarship, Anusha Castaigne, who's sitting here, I won't mention at the front, who joins us here today. So I'd just like to give her a round of applause. And so this is scholarship Motu awards annually to the top economics undergraduate student in the country. The idea is to encourage them to pursue their studies in econometrics at a graduate level. So Anushka has just finished her undergraduate degree at Victoria, and next year will pursue an honours degree at the University of Auckland. And to date, fair to say, studies have focused on quantitative approaches to understanding social and environmental issues. So it's great to have Anushka with us. Okay, quick thank you to organisations that have made this event possible, apart from Motu. First, the New Zealand Treasury and the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. Both of those two organisations have been long-standing supporters of the PS, these public policy seminars. Second, Russell McVeigh for welcoming us and allowing us to host these seminars in their beautiful, centrally located whare here. So it's a real privilege for us to be able to meet in this space. So we really appreciate that. Third, the Home Foundation, who have sponsored today's seminar, and they do a lot of work, amazing work to improve housing outcomes for New Zealanders. Finally, MB. Any reps from MB here today? No MB people? One, yes, good. Would like to thank you in particular, personally, for funding the Public Housing and Urban Regeneration Maximising Wellbeing grant. I joke, but this is under the Endeavour program. These grants are really important. It's what's enabled the research that we're going to hear about today. Okay. Some brief housekeeping. Bathrooms, an accessible bathroom is located down a level. Down the stairs, I don't know quite how that works. Is there an elevator as well?
The accessible one's on this level, the downstairs.
Oh, got you. Okay, that's a good clarification. Thank you. Emergency exits located at the bottom and the top of the staircase up here. In the case of emergency, please leave the building immediately using the nearest exit. Try to avoid using the elevators, even though we're high up, and leave personal items behind. And if you need assistance, let us know and a fire warden can help you. Case of emergency for earthquakes, usual drop, cover, hold, stay in the building and await further instruction. I'm learning all this, by the way, because I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Auckland, so earthquakes are a bit of a new thing for me. So I'm saying this as much for my own benefit. And the assembly area is in Midland Park, which is out the front of the building. So, all right. So each speaker will now talk for about 25 minutes. We have allowed half an hour at the end for questions. For those of you joining us online, it's now over 60. That's great. Please put your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. For those on the floor, we have a microphone that will be roving. I tried to convince Dave Murray to run around with it, but he said, no, I'm semi-retired now, so I don't do that sort of thing. No, that's not true. Dave was very happy to. But please, when you ask a question, state your name and affiliation, just for those of us who don't know you. And then obviously try and keep the question as brief as possible. Apologies in advance if we don't get through all the questions, but feel free to follow up with us afterward via email. Is that fine, Arthur and Jaimie? Yep, you're welcome questions. Researchers love questions about their research, just as a general rule. It's an honor to get questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Arthur Grimes. Many of you will know, Senior Fellow at Motu Research and a Professor of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University of Wellington School of Government. Arthur's current research focuses on the economics of well-being and public policy, and also urban economics, including but not limited to housing. He's published widely in these fields, among others. So I'd like to welcome Arthur up to talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I said we don't have something in front of us, right? Okay. Well, let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Okay. So this is, Stuart said, this is work that I'm going to talk to you about today. It was funded from an MB Endeavour grant that led by Philippa Howden Chapman at the back there. Just fractionally too advanced now to be considered for our new scholarship for new people. Philippa's led a huge amount of work on housing, as we know, and she was the leader of this particular grant. And then the work I'm going to talk to you about today is actually based on a paper with Colin Smith, Kimberly O'Sullivan, Philippa, Lydia and Rachel. So this is work plus, well, it's very much my interpretation of that work. This program was a 4-year program funded by MB4, 5, something like that. Seemed 5. And what we did is we worked with several social housing providers that included Kaingaora, included what was then the Wellington City Council in terms of their housing, plus some housing trusts, etc. And one of the things that we did early on in this was to run a survey of tenants in social housing or public housing. I'll use those two terms interchangeably, by the way, public housing and social housing. And we ran a survey of adult tenants there, and also, as we'll see, some other control groups as well. The three main research questions which we wanted to look at. One was, does being in public housing improve the well-being of people in public housing relative to being in other forms of tenancies, either a private sector renter or a owner-occupier? So that was sort of the primary one, but there was also two, like, subsidiary research questions, is do these effects differ by the nature of the person who's in the public housing? And then also, what aspects of the house and what aspects of the neighbourhood affect people's well-being? So those are the central sort of questions that I'm going to talk about today. And just some background, and this is sometimes lost, I think, in the discussion about the role of public housing in New Zealand. It's actually, there's a social allocation system that's run when people apply to get into public housing. And it's extraordinarily difficult to get into public housing because of the very few spaces that are available for public housing in New Zealand. We have a much lower proportion of public housing relative to most other developed countries. I think our proportion is about 3.8% of the housing stock is in public housing. In Europe, its average is about 6%, and it goes up to 20 or so. So it's very, very difficult to get into social housing in New Zealand. And you're assessed based on your adequacy. For instance, if you're in emergency housing or homeless at the moment, your suitability, such things as family violence, etc. Affordability, not surprisingly. Accessibility, you're in a group that might be being discriminated against. And sustainability, which includes your social functioning, your social skills, whether you have some mental health problems and these sorts of things. So you can imagine, to get to the top of the waiting list, to get into the become eligible for public housing, you have to be very severely affected by multiple aspects of your life, it's not just an affordability issue. And sometimes when I see the political debate, it's about people, yes, there's subsidised rents in public housing and there's not elsewhere or whatever. But actually that's only one very small part of being eligible for public housing. It's all these other things. And importantly, from a researcher's point of view, and also from generally speaking from policy, if you're not speaking to the people themselves, a lot of these aspects are unobservable. We don't observe the fact that somebody's being discriminated against, or they've got poor social functioning, or they're a subject to family violence or something like that. So when we do the work, we're going to be biasing all our results against any benefits of public housing, because people in public housing are going to have low well-being for a whole host of other reasons. So we have to sort of understand that our results are going to be biased against finding positive effects of public housing. Not just us, but anybody else out there who's been doing work discussing the role of public housing as well. And I just want to talk about a couple of related studies before we talk about the work that we've done. There's Connell Smith and Caitlin Davies did some nice work where they looked at samples from the General Social Survey, the GSS, and also Kaingaora data to see what kind of aspects of housing are important for people's well-being. And not surprisingly, they found that people living in poor housing or mouldy housing or cold housing had lower well-being relative to others. So that's an important aspect. A really impressive paper that came out of the Social Investment Agency in 2018. I'd argue this is probably the most important work that the Social Investment Agency ever did, was because it's such high quality. Is that what they did is they looked at people in the General Social Survey, the Stats New Zealand survey, for a few months before they got into public housing. So that was like the before group, but they were still people who were going to go into public housing, and people who had been in public housing for a few months in the after group. So they could compare people, all of whom were going to go into public housing, but because of the timing of the survey relative to when they went into public housing, we could see these were people in private rentals about to go into public housing, or people in public housing who had been in private rentals recently. So they had a lovely control group, which generally we don't have in this space. And what they found is, using that word, is that there was people moved from private to public housing. They had an improvement in lower incidence of mould, lower incidence of crowding, lower incidence of poor condition housing. In other words, it was very clear that the public housing stock was much better than the housing stock that they were in before they went into public housing. Sometimes you hear criticisms about Kainga Ora houses or something, that they're not very good. But actually, they may not be fantastic, but they're a lot better than where the people have come from. Okay, so that's really important. And what they found is that life satisfaction improved as well. So overall, how you feel about your life, people felt better once they were in public housing than when they were in private rentals. The only thing that was a negative there was that they felt more unsafe when walking at night. So because of the neighbourhood that they moved into from where they were. But other than that, basically all of the things were positive. That's a fantastic paper. If you ever want to go back to it, Simon Anastasiadis was a Motu RA, of course. Another very, very recent paper, Osoro et al. And Neville Pierce, Professor at Otago and others from the same program, wanted to look at, there's been some recent sort of studies, shall we say, where people have said, oh, actually, but all you need is the accommodation supplement, and people there are similar to the people in public housing, etc. If you see those studies that say that, they're complete rubbish, okay? Because what this paper showed is that using IDI data, they found that the people in public housing, because they have a much richer availability in the IDI to look at people's mental health and all sorts of other things, people in public housing are much more severely afflicted with multiple afflictions, if you like, than people in using accommodation supplement. And I'll just give you one example, which I'm shamelessly stolen from their paper. And the red line of people on accommodation supplement, blue line of people about to go into public housing. And this is 1 year before the dates of going into public housing, 2 years before, 3 years before, 4 years before, 5 years before. These are mental patient, outpatient interactions and inpatient interactions. And what you see is that just in the lead up to going, not only is people in public housing have more mental health problems than people in private housing, accommodation supplement, but also in the lead up to going into public housing, there's a much steeper increase in mental health problems in people who are about to go into public housing than ones who stay in private housing. So this is a beautiful study. It's in Housing and Society. It's just been published. I recommend it highly. They look not just at mental health, but at many other afflictions as well. And basically the story is that people who go into public housing are much more, have many more issues in their lives than people who are just straight on accommodation supplement. So when you see studies that have been done for the government about comparing the two populations, they are not accurate, basically, okay? This is a superb study. I highly recommend it. It's not my work, so I can praise it to the hilt. So what did we do? In this program, we worked with these providers. We had a survey where we asked a lot of questions. Almost all of these questions, by the way, were taken from Stats New Zealand. Anybody here running surveys, I highly recommend using word for word the questions and the answer categories that Stats New Zealand have also already trialled on people, so that you know they validated questions and you can compare them with Stats New Zealand data. So we asked questions on who their housing provider was, the housing conditions, the suitability for themselves, whether they found the house suitable for their needs. We asked questions about their neighbourhood and also their public transport in their neighbourhood, and then a whole bunch of variables that basically come out of the general social survey about culture and spirituality, their material well-being and their subjective well-being. So we had a wide range of data from on people's characteristics and well-being and housing. As I said, we ran this survey with social housing tenants across our 7 providers, and also with some private renters and owner occupiers who are living in the same area as where there was dense public housing. So we wanted to compare like with like as much as possible. These were people who were living in private rentals or own their own house, but in areas around the same neighbourhood as people in social housing. The analysis I'm going to talk about today just concentrates on the Wellington results. They're pretty representative of elsewhere in the country, but our sample of private renters and owner occupiers are in Wellington, so I'm going to compare like with like. And what we see here is, as we expect, this is equivalised household income, so it equivalises for the number of people in the household, which is important. And not surprisingly, on average in our survey, people owner-occupiers were a lot richer than, had much higher incomes than people in private renters, and they were much better off than people in public housing. And that's probably, he doesn't agree with the results from the said Morse code. Anyway, if anybody can understand the Morse code, they can let me know later on. So the people in public housing, as we would expect, much poorer than people in private. And if we ask people a question which is used by Stats New Zealand about does your household income meet your needs, there's 4 categories that can be included there. Basically, public housing and private rentals, and private rentals now come out to be pretty much the same. And obviously owner-occupiers much better off. So these are people who say they don't have enough income in their household to meet their needs. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that there is subsidised rents, income-related rents in public housing, where there's not. In private housing people get accommodation supplement, but clearly that income-related rents is making a big difference to whether their household income meets their needs or not, even though they're much poorer. When we look at well-being, what metrics have we used? We've used 2 that are out of the general social survey and also in Te Kupenga, the Maori version of the general social survey from Stats New Zealand. The life satisfaction one is one that's used around the world now. People are asked, first of all, we'd like to ask you a very general question about your life as a whole. With on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is completely dissatisfied, 10 is completely satisfied, how do you feel about your life as a whole? This is very much taking a sort of holistic view of your life, okay? And that's used right around the world now, the Gallup poll and OECD, etc., like that, use this. Then there's another measure that the World Health Organization devised some years ago, which is also asked in the General Social Survey and in Te Kupenga. And basically you're asked 5 questions, you're asked on a 0 to 5 scale, whether over the last 2 weeks, this is not your life as a whole, this is just in the last 2 weeks, have you felt cheerful and good spirits, calm and relaxed, active and vigorous, fresh and rested, or filled with things that interest me? And these are then summed as a validated scale to there, but it's a shorter term measure of well-being, it's a longer term measure of well-being. So we asked these questions of everyone in our survey, and interestingly, when we come to the life satisfaction side, we see that just in raw data without controlling for anything else, owner-occupiers, not surprisingly, feel best about their life as a whole. But then comes public renters well ahead of private renters. So remember that to get into public housing, you have to be multiply disadvantaged. You have to have all these other afflictions of family violence and desperation and all sorts of things really to be able to get in. And yet their overall satisfaction with their life is higher than people in private rentals. And the same story goes with the short-term measures. And there, in terms of short-term, people in public housing are just as happy overall as our owner-occupiers, slightly higher. So this is suggesting that the being in public housing is definitely improving their life outcomes. We then did a lot of statistical work and all the different types of ones are up there, basically to see whether there's an association of these tenants, the tenancy status, public, private rental, owner-occupied, with these 2 measures of well-being, and then whether those effects are affected by the tenant characteristics, by the types of people that are in there. And we also look at which factors are most associated with people's answers about how suitable their house is, how suitable their neighbourhood is, and also whether those are affected differently by different people. And the main findings is that relative for life satisfaction, so this is the long-term life satisfaction, once you control for everything else, public tenants roughly equal or slightly higher well-being than private tenants. Again, remembering this is biased against finding for outcomes for public tenants, and pretty similar or maybe just fractionally lower than owner-occupiers, not much difference. For the WHO5, for their short-term well-being, the last 2 weeks, their short-term well-being is significantly higher, and as we saw in the graph, significantly higher in a statistical sense as well, relative to private tenants, and approximately equal to owner-occupiers. So this is how you've been feeling over the last 2 weeks. People in public tenancies are feeling as good as people in owner-occupation and better than people in private tenancies, despite all these other problems that we might expect in their lives. And the thing that we found really made a difference in some of these relationships was how long people had been in their tenancies. What we found is that the longer you're in your tenancy, the lower the discrepancy between being in a public rental and a private rental was. Okay. And our interpretation of that, I'll show you the graph. This is what this is saying is on a scale of 0 to 125. On average, people in private tenancies were 17 points below people in public tenancies if they'd only just moved into their tenancy, so 0 years in tenancy. Once it got to, say, 10 years or so, there was no significant difference. So people who have been in their private tenancy for private rental for 10 years in the same place were as happy statistically as people who are in public rentals. And obviously it sort of keeps going up. So what this, and the same pattern with owner occupation as well, relative to owner occupier. So this is suggestive, and it doesn't prove it, but it's suggestive that security of tenure is a big part of the story about why people are happier in public housing than they are in private housing. I've often said to people that I can't imagine being in a situation of bringing up a family, Stuart, where you could be kicked out of your house in the next 3 months. It just seems to me extraordinary that in New Zealand we can have laws that allow people to be evicted without reason within a space of, we just want you out. Sort of how that must affect your overall well-being must be very, very negative. And so obviously in public housing one has a much greater security of tenure. Sorry if you want to sneak in behind. Shall I keep going? Yeah. Good. Okay. In terms of what house characteristics are important, same sort of features were coming up in our survey as we found in the previous work. Being in things that really are important are whether you're in a damp house, a cold house. Interestingly, too warm in summer, and this was a sample in Wellington, which made me a little bit suspicious about that one. Public transport availability, but there was some differences here depending on ethnicity and gender. And interestingly, when we asked people whether they're happy to have visitors in their house, if you're in a house with very poor dwelling condition, where you said the dwelling condition was very poor, Maori were much less comfortable about welcoming visitors to their house if they had a poor condition house than were non-Maori. When we break it down by gender, females were also much less happy about welcoming people, but blokes didn't care less. Yeah. Okay, so who cares? In fact, probably slightly more positive if it's in really bad condition, right? Just trashed it. So that was an interesting little finding. My wife verified that one, by the way. Yeah. In terms of the neighbourhood, the things that really counted were having high social capital, and we had lots of measures of that. Safety of neighbourhood at night really mattered as well, okay? And we actually didn't find any differences on these by ethnicity or gender. So just to summarise, before I get cut off in these for time, essentially a house is viewed favourably, doesn't matter what kind of tenancy you're in. If it's in good condition, it's warm and it's dry. And remembering that this key result from the Social Investment Agency study was that when you move from private rentals to public rentals, on average, you move to a house that's warmer and drier and better condition. Okay, so that's an important aspect. Neighbourhoods viewed favourably has high social capital and it's safe. We see that public tenants are much poorer than people in private tenancies, who are in turn much poorer on average than people in owner occupation. But they have higher wellbeing, and especially short-term wellbeing, their WHO5, than do people in private tenancies, and roughly the same as people who are owner occupiers. And our interpretation of our results is that one of the reasons for this result in particular, public tenants versus private tenants, is that being in stable tenure, knowing that you're there and you're safe in terms of your tenancy, counts in terms of your wellbeing. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Just to confirm, we are renting, but my well-being is quite high at the moment. So partly because I enjoy the challenge of grappling in battle with my landlord, who doesn't seem to understand anything about how rental markets work, but that's a story for another day. So second speaker, we are doing very well in terms of time, I think, right on time. Second speaker, Jaimie Monk. Joined Motu Research as a fellow in 2022 after finishing her PhD in public policy. She's also the research lead at Home Foundation, and her research focuses on family wellbeing, housing, child poverty, and children's technology use in Aotearoa. That's not a very controversial topic at the moment, is it? No. And she frequently utilizes data from the Growing Up in New Zealand study, which many of you might have heard about. So please welcome Jaimie up.
Nice. Set my timer, so make sure we stick to time.
We'll make sure you stick to time.
All right, well, kia ora koutou. Assuming you didn't all just show up for the lunch, that you're actually here to be interested in housing and wellbeing. It's a delight to be here and to be able to share some of the findings from this work. When you invest a lot of time and energy in research, it's always so great when people are interested in what you're doing. So thank you for being here, and hello to everyone who's joining online, who can confirm definitely didn't show up for free lunch. But I'm hoping that you've got something tasty to eat for lunch, and it's nice to have you here too. I'm not sure where I'm looking into the sky. There's a camera somewhere. Oh, awesome. So those of you I haven't met, there's a number of you here I have. It's so great to see you. Jaimie Monk toku ingoa, so I'm a fellow at Motu here and also the research lead at Home Foundation. So this is bringing my two worlds together quite nicely, which is great. I live down in Ototahi with my husband, David, who's here as well to carry my bags. And our 3 children as well. Down there. And so my background is in economics and public policy, but increasingly, since a lot of my work focuses on issues like child poverty and housing, which are very multidisciplinary, I find myself in a lot of different places, looking at things from different angles. And so when I got the chance to join this team to do this work, then Philippa asked me to come along and do some work on children and children's wellbeing. I was just in my total happy place, and a team full of people from lots of different perspectives. So out of that has come this work, where I've used Growing Up in New Zealand data to try and understand the housing experiences of children, with a particular focus on those in public housing. Should also say Arthur helped with this piece of work as well. This has been a joint effort. All right, I'm just going to go through, give a quick introduction, some methods. 2 main kind of results I'll be sharing with you. The first is trajectories of wellbeing of children's behavioural development from 2 years to 9 years. And secondly is a piece focusing on 12-year-olds, where we actually get data from the children themselves and find out how their quality of life is. Which is wonderful, and then some conclusions and policy recommendations. All right, so what were we interested in? Many of you, I'm hoping anyway, have picked up the idea that the first sort of early years of life are just incredibly important for kids and for kids' development. We're talking the first 2,000 days, a period from conception through to about 2 years of age. There's a huge amount of brain architecture that's being developed within children over that period. And these kids spend a lot of time at home. And so home is an incredibly important place for us to understand how it affects and interacts with their development. In New Zealand, as Arthur said, public housing is something that we provide to families, and particularly to the families that are facing the biggest disadvantages. And so these kids that get access to public housing are in an environment where there is stability. There is probably going to be better quality housing, and it's an affordable situation for the family finances too. And so interested in the children that got given this support during this critical early period, what their trajectories are ongoing. And so then we're looking at that, we're looking at comparing them with children who started life in other tenure types, and then trying to understand whether the findings are similar for tamariki Māori as well. All right, I thought I'd do rather sort of visual representation of my literature review, which is trying to understand the relationship between housing and children's wellbeing. Most important when we're looking at children's wellbeing, particularly young children, it's inextricably linked with parent wellbeing. Most of children's development, particularly their social emotional development at these early ages, comes from their interactions with their parents. And so we can't really separate these two things out. So they're very close. In terms of how housing influences it, firstly, housing quality and size. We have a huge amount of really high quality New Zealand research on the link between warm, dry, healthy homes and children's physical health, which is very related to their wellbeing as well. Affordability, another big issue in New Zealand. Housing affordability, if you've got no money left over after housing, then there is not much to spend on the important things like healthy food, educational opportunities for children, all these other good things for their development. I've also done in some previous work looking at the role of stress, so financial stress on families that stems often in New Zealand from a high housing costs, and the relationship between that financial stress and parent stress and therefore the children's development. Housing stress seems to be a really central part of the stress that new parents in particular are facing. So that's really important. And also we've got up here security of tenure, which is Arthur alluded to as well. How that affects children, it's probably a little different across different ages. I suspect the effect for the early years, it comes more through the parents. So the stress of moving house with a 2-year-old, if anyone's gone through that process, I don't recommend it. That could be hard. Whereas older children, adolescents, breaking up of friend groups, having to re-establish yourself socially is more of a thing at an older age. All right, so very quickly, the Growing Up in New Zealand study is where I've drawn this data from. I should say this is very quantitative in its approach, and I'm not aiming here to give the whole picture of everything, but to give this particular picture from a quantitative perspective. But we're looking at nearly 7,000 children. These kids were born in 2009-10, so making them about 15, 16 years old now, and a really diverse sample of children as well, which is one of the big strengths of the Growing Up in New Zealand study. The data I've used for this, for the first piece of work for the 2 to 8-year-olds, I'm drawing on from the waves of pregnancy to 8 years of age. It's mother-reported data, mostly. I unfortunately couldn't use the father-reported data for some statistical reasons, but so that's mother-reported, and then at 12 years, we have this wonderful child-reported data, so we can find out what the kids' experiences are then. Okay, so my main outcome variable, for those of you that have seen some of my other work, I've focused also on this outcome, which is the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. This picks up children's behaviour or their social and emotional development. It's split into 2 main parts, the strengths part, which talks about pro-social behaviour and how helpful and kind children are, and then a difficulties measure. So I'm going to give some results that focus on difficulties, but also some that split it into internalising and externalising problems. So internalising is emotional problems and peer relationship problems, externalising is hyperactivity and conduct problems. And so when we talk about difficulties, it's these 4 things that we're capturing in that measure. For the 12-year-old quality of life data analysis I've used, quality quality of life, which is developed from the Kids Screen 10 measure, 10 questions that kids get asked about their life. Has a slight health bent, but it's meant to capture a whole quality of life. And so the questions are things like, have you felt full of energy? Have you had fun with your friends? Things that are really important to children. And so then use an OLS regression to look at the association between the early tenure and then the later self-reported quality of life. In terms of the tenure, we've got a variable with 4 options. We've got about half of the children in the group are in privately owned homes. About 9% are in public rental. So I've classed them as that if they're living in a public rental during the pregnancy or 9-month wave. Otherwise, at 9 months, we capture this data. In private rentals, about 1/3. So this is obviously higher than the country's average. We do focus public housing on children. So that probably a little bit higher than the population as a whole, but that's quite important when you're focusing on public rental groups. So I'm not going to explain the equations other than at a conceptual level for the growth curve analysis. This is the trajectories from 2 years to 9 years. If you can imagine, we've drawn thousands of lines. So it's sort of like taking 6,000 or so lines and then taking the average of that line to get the trajectory. So this is conceptually quite different to taking an average at, say, 2 years, an average at 4.5, and an average at 8. One of the wonderful things about longitudinal data, like growing up in New Zealand, is we can actually capture some of the within child changes that are happening and to map trajectories that way, which gives us a much clearer picture. All right, so this is the results for 2 to 9-year-olds. This is probably the central findings from the piece of work. So on the left here, we've got child difficulties, the trajectories across the different tenure types. So at the top here, the blue line is the public rental group. We've got private rental and ownership. And we can see here that this public rental group has much higher initial difficulty scores, but that over time, these come together and we get a convergence happening. I will say I'm fairly sure we're underreporting the convergence that's happening due to some of the attrition in the study. A lot of the kids with the higher difficulty scores dropped out further on, so we've managed to capture the early data, but less. So I think this is an underreporting of the convergence. Wasn't quite sure what we were going to get actually when we started this, because there's other studies from using Australian data, very similar, that are showing more of a coming apart. And again, these are the most disadvantaged children, particularly on paper anyway. And so I think what we're getting here is a story of public housing helping over time, and there's some cumulative benefits happening. Strengths is really interesting. There's obviously not really much difference here in terms of the strengths measure. And I've found this across other work that I've done as well, that pro-social behaviour doesn't seem to differ by demographic groups or socio-demographic groups in the way that the difficulties does, which suggests that there's parents that are doing a really good job of teaching their children manners, teaching them to be kind and caring towards other people. And so maybe these children are doing well on that front, but are also still struggling with paying attention or maintaining emotional control in certain situations, and that some of those might be some more structural factors behind that. When we split it into externalizing and externalizing very similar kind of to the overall difficulty score. Internalizing is a little bit different. We kind of almost get a bit parallel until about 5 years. My suspicion here is this is the school effect. This is when they start school. And so there's probably some extra support that these kids are getting from the education system that might be helping close some of the gaps once they're at school. Sorry for lots of graphs, but I also have looked at, I've done a model that includes sex at birth and household structure at birth in that first year. Picking out the differences between boys and girls, very normal in that girls tend to develop a little bit faster on the social emotional front than boys. So we're picking that up. That's common in the international literature. The household structure part's interesting. Kids that are in two-parent families have much lower problem behaviour scores across the board. There's probably a lot happening beneath the surface there in terms of both practical and emotional support when you have two parents in a household, but also financial potentially as well. There's another group here which is interesting, and that's the kids that have a relative living in the home with them when they're born. And that group was bigger than I thought. So about a quarter of the sample had another adult relative living in the household. And that was up to half of the public housing group. And so these kids have higher initial scores, but they actually get better faster than the other groups. And so I think this is probably picking up some of the tensions that you see in terms of overcrowding is not generally a very good thing in terms of health outcomes, and maybe living in an overcrowded house with a 2-year-old again could be full on. But over time, there's cumulative benefits that happen when you've got other family members around. And so maybe actually having houses that are big enough or affordable enough that we can have intergenerational living and see some of those benefits ongoing. All right, so in terms of where these kids ended up by the time that they turned 12, I've broken my cardinal rule and actually put a regression output table in my slides, so I'd like to apologise. I think I can get the message across still though. The basic message being when we look at the relationship between early tenure and overall quality of life, at 12 years, the public and private rental groups are a little bit lower. But as soon as they start controlling for anything, including some of these selection effects into public housing, those differences disappear, except for the private rental group here, which still are a little bit lower. And so the overall picture being for a group of kids that started life very disadvantaged on paper, by the time they're 12, they're saying that their quality of life is good. The moving picture is an interesting one. So this here is the relationship between how many times a child moves house over their 12 years of life and their quality of life. And we can see there's a lot of moving happens before there's any real effects. So we've got 4 moves and 5 moves, we're starting to get slightly lower scores. But again, these disappear once we start controlling for things. And I wrestled with this a little bit because I was expecting to find some, real problems to do with moving a lot. But I think what I ended up thinking about is the fact that moving happens for lots of good reasons for families, as well as bad reasons. So we can be moving for a job opportunity, or to move into a school zone, or upsizing a house because there's a new baby in the family. Lots of this type of moving happens. And look, going to the international literature, basically for people that have really dived into this, it seems to me it's the reason for moving that's important, not necessarily the moving itself. So I suspect a bunch of this moving might be happening, possibly the stress is going on the parents, and the parents are doing a reasonable job of protecting their kids from the disruption as well. So yeah, it was an interesting thing to wrestle with as I went. And finally, I just did an extra equation where I put in a lot of these control variables, which are very much endogenous and probably quite associated with quality of life, but just as a way of trying to capture what kids are saying are as important to their quality of life. And I've taken a snapshot of my table here, but the sort of things they're pulling out that seem to be statistically associated with quality of life are to a parent-child closeness, not being bullied. This was the biggest coefficient here, was to do with being bullied several times a week, which is probably not surprising. Teacher-child relationship being important, and also the number of times they were outdoors over a week, which I thought was an interesting, nice little thing to be thinking about as we're talking about children and housing. Okay. All right, so a couple of conclusions and some policy implications. Overall, what we're seeing, wellbeing disparities greatest in the early years, but a convergence over time. Trajectories were actually similar for tamariki Māori. I haven't put the tables in there, but they all looked very, very similar. Child strengths and pro-social behaviour doesn't vary by tenure. We need to be thinking about household structure when we're thinking about public housing and housing interventions for children, and that most children seem reasonably resilient to moving. A couple of considerations. So while these behaviour outcomes were converging over time, at 5 years old, when these kids are starting school, there was still reasonable gaps. And these things, the gaps relate to things like the ability to pay attention and to get on well with other children, which are really important for school. And so there may well be some educational outcomes that are not showing this nice convergence, and these kids probably do still need a lot of that extra support by the time they're at school. Also importantly, we don't know what happens into the teenage years. This is why I'm really glad that Growing Up in New Zealand's got its funding continued, so I can answer this question later on. Because up to 12 years is a very interesting developmental period. Into the teenage years, things change quite a lot in terms of how children relate to the world, how they understand their position in the world, friendships, relationships, all these sorts of things start to come into play. So I'd be curious to see how things turn out in the long term. There's also a couple of limitations to the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire as a measure. It's been very well validated internationally across a bunch of different cultures, but some work focused in on New Zealand did show that we probably need to be a bit careful in terms of the cultural applicability of the SDQ. So I haven't presented any results based on ethnicity or anything like that in this, so we just need to keep that in the back of our minds. In terms of policy implications, I want to again say, it's just so important to take a developmental perspective when we're thinking about children and housing and what they need at each stage. And housing can be a big source of stress for families and for parents in particular. And so, which means that providing housing support for families has flow-on benefits to children and their development. And finally, I thought, since this is a public policy seminar, I thought I would include this piece of work I've done more recently for Home Foundation. I've been trying to conceptualize for everybody how housing affects wellbeing, or human flourishing is the language we use at Home Foundation. But I wanted to get it in one diagram so we can think about what we're doing and measuring our impact, but also as we're thinking about wider policies and the wider system, how things work together. So affordability, which we've talked about. Place, which I haven't got to delve into too much in this last work, but the wider program did a lot of really good stuff on this. So access to whenua, to being close to amenities, transport, schools, healthcare, all these sorts of things, that good neighbourhoods that make up good neighbourhoods. We've got housing quality, so the warm, dry, accessible if it needs to be accessible, the right size, and a concept I've called housing agency. And this is something that came out of my wrestle in these results I was finding with the families in terms of moving, because so much of the moving is positive, but we really need security of tenure as well. So this idea of housing agency captures the fact that families need to have a secure place if they want to stay where they are, but they also need the opportunity to move if that's what they want as well, whether it's move for the new job or move to live close to grandma when you've had another baby and need extra support. This concept of agency captures both of those. And I've got these arrows here because these are all trade-offs. These are actually things that when a family is trying to decide where they live, they're making trade-offs. You might decide to live in a much smaller house because it's in a school zone that you want your kids to be at, or take a hit on affordability and invest more because your child is prone to illness and to live in a warm, dry house. So these are things that are trade-offs. So rather than thinking about something like the housing continuum, when we're trying to move people along to some sort of utopia of home ownership, which is generally a good thing, but not necessarily what everyone's after, we can actually think about expanding out people's access to these sorts of things and expanding out their options in terms of their housing. So that's where my thinking's at on this. I'm very happy to discuss this with anybody as we go. But I think it's my final slide. So any questions, seriously send me an email or on LinkedIn. Be good.
Yeah, just here. Yeah. All right. Well done, guys. Two great presentations, and you're bang on time. So we've got half an hour for questions. Any questions? Yes. And just name and affiliation.
Hi, Jeff Bertram. I'm sort of from Victoria, I guess. A question for Arthur, really. Within the category of rental housing, you've got a binary distinction there, private and public. And I'm just wondering whether you can get further into the public housing with the data you've got, particularly the distinction between kāinga ora and other providers of social housing, because I mean, that's the point at which the boundary lies between central government and other providers, and I'm anticipating there's some quality difference to be found there.
Yeah, actually, I think we can be heard anyway. So, yeah, we did the initial work. I mean, we're starting to get into smaller sample sizes, so be aware of that. We had kāinga ora housing, we had what was then Wellington City Council housing, which is Aotearoa New Zealand, and we had some housing trusts, we had Dwell, Salvation Army, and others. Actually, we didn't find significant differences between those different groups in terms of wellbeing outcomes, which is why I didn't bother showing them here. Now, that could be for two reasons. One is that there may be no differences. It may be just the sample sizes were too small to pick anything up. But fundamentally, there didn't seem to be major differences. And I think, you know, and it comes back to how I interpret the results, is that in each of those, people have got stable tenure. And I think that's a really critical thing that's often been overlooked in terms of the discussion about quality of housing. I think the stable tenure is a really big result. But that would be my reflection.
Thank you. Yes.
Rachel Fleet, just to follow up on that. So how do you sort of tease out though, what's the house and the, sorry, hi, I'll ask again, Rachel Fleet. Just a follow-up question. So how do you tease out what's the house, the stable tenure, and then what is the sort of like the pastoral care or the social landlord services, or just those other sort of networks and other supports that also come with public housing?
Yeah, we can't tease out all of those factors. We can tease out the effects of house quality and neighbourhood quality and things like that. And I looked at that both with and without controlling for those things. The results are actually consistent whether or not we control for those aspects, which is sort of like the more physical and social aspects in terms of the neighbourhood. We don't have any data, at least in this survey, on those broader care, if you like, of the agencies for people in the broader program. This is only one very small part of a much broader program that Philippa organised. We did have a lot of other aspects in that broad program to look at some of those things. So I would encourage you to look at the website, Public Housing Regeneration website, to look at some of those broader aspects, because they're really important.
All right, thank you. We'll take an online question next, and then we'll come back to the floor.
So from an anonymous attendee, for Arthur Grimes, were you able to look at whether there were differences between public, private and owner-occupied between similar equivalized age cohorts?
Yeah, we controlled for age, so absolutely. I mean, so our results can control for age, income, gender, ethnicity, all those sorts of things. So this is after controlling for those sorts of aspects. Absolutely.
Yes, one question.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. David's running around. He's doing a good job.
First of all, thank you very much for sharing your work. I mean, it's challenging. I'm going to have to do some reading just to see the significance of what you're saying. My name's Peter. I'm actually a member of Grey Power, the Wellington Central group, and I'm also a resident of a housing complex in Newtown, Hanson Court Apartments. Can I make a suggestion for future research? You have an interesting discussion about different clients in different locations regarding who provides the housing. I'm in a situation now where Te Toi Mahana and other providers actually have different kinds of tenants based on how their rents are calculated. For example, those people who are long-term tenants are still being asked to pay a percentage of market rate, only a portion of whom are eligible for housing accommodation supplement, and then a reasonably small number of people who come through MSD. What I'm suggesting for research is that With this change, I think you'll find behaviour and outcome and livability will actually be significantly different inside a single provider rather than between them. Because what I'm finding is that there's increased resentment, anxiety, concern. I don't have stats, but I think it's worth doing research on so as to get beyond the emotional issues into a informed, speculative discussion about what's happening.
Yeah, no, that's a really great idea. So two aspects to it. One is the reason for what you were talking about, for those who don't know, is Te Toi Mahana was the City Council provided social housing provider. And when it was City Council, government wouldn't give the tenants income-related rents. Bizarre policy, right? Once they became converted into becoming a housing trust as a chip, as social care, they were the new tenants, the ones who moved in after that, became eligible for income-related rents. So why that previous rule was there, God only knows. But anyway, it's now the case that new tenants are eligible, but the old tenants aren't, even though they're still in the same place. But you're right, this is a beautiful research design. So from a researcher's point of view, we love these really poor quality public, public policy decisions because they give us something to test. So that's great. And I'll just come back to the very first remarks that Stuart made. We are open to do this research, and if somebody here has some funding because it is an important thing. What's the role of income-related rents as opposed to other things within the same housing complex would be a fantastic thing to research. And so with all the funders around here, Corey, I'm looking at you. But I think it's a really fantastic thing because it would actually allow us to actually look at the importance of income-related rents versus other things. So thanks for the idea.
Yeah, and more generally, if there's policies that are changing, please let us know, because that's often a really good research experiment. I remember Dave and Dean, you did the work on the accommodation supplement, right? Which was due to changes in the accommodation supplement, which allowed them to analyse that in a lot of detail. So it's really good to know about these changes in policies or discrepancies. Yeah. Question online?
Yes, another anonymous. For Jaimie Monk, were reasons for house moves asked in growing up in New Zealand? If so, were you able to look at whether those made a difference to wellbeing scores?
Yes, it was asked, only in the later waves though. And so I've done some exploratory work on it. And I just wasn't able to capture what I thought was happening enough that it was reliable and publishable. There's a little bit that's been done if you look on the Growing Up in New Zealand website. I'm talking to the camera up there. If you look on the Growing Up in New Zealand website, there's some housing papers there that have got sort of snippets of information that gives you some descriptive stats on who's moving and why. That's really helpful to start from anyway.
Jaimie, just riffing off that question, because that was related to a question I had about you would be familiar with the Raj Chetty Moving to Opportunity paper, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I think they find an interesting result where moves before the age of 12 did not have a negative effect, but moves after the age of 12 did.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got you're right on that boundary.
12
So you're just desperate for that.
I'm desperate for the next wave of data.
Very good.
Which is coming soon, isn't it? The 15-year-old.
Yeah, that's been done, so we need to,
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the research, really fascinating. Rob Graham, Housing Policy Team with MSD, 20 plus years with public housing, mainly here and also in Australia. Fascinated with the research you
Yes, talk straight to the microphone, Rob.
Sorry, particularly fascinating with the research you did on the growing up in New Zealand. I recall to see the authors at the University of Auckland 15 odd years ago and seeing what would be done, and nothing got traction, so that's great. Many fascinating aspects of your research. Just picking up on the issue around moves and transients. If I hadn't been sort of engaged my brain and looked at the results, I would have been surprised because there's plenty of research around the impacts of transients. As you said, it's important to distinguish the different reasons. A couple of suggestions there. One is, and you may already have looked into this stuff, business-initiated transfers, just transfers within Housing New Zealand would be part of that. And usually the way that's done is to try and find a suitable solution for the household, keeping them within the school zone, for example, or gaining the tenants agreement that they are willing to move. So you could distinguish that. Also, another small portion that be worth distinguishing, if you can, is around evictions, which vary hugely over the years, depending on the policy of Housing New Zealand at the time. But then beyond that, I think you could dig into all the other different reasons. So if the scope to do that in further research, I think that would be an important area to look at. I'll stop there and just again, thank you for the research.
One question online and then we'll come to you, Libby.
Yes, so from Iman Cheng from Martin Jenkins, were there any particular findings in relation to Asian and or other populations? And did either studies include people with refugee or forced displacement backgrounds?
I'd say from my side, not really, because the sample size was too small for mine, but I think they're pretty larger than yours.
Yes, so there's about 1,000 Asian families in the initial cohort and growing up in New Zealand. So that is definitely captured in the data. I haven't distinguished by ethnicity, a little bit to do with the SDQ kind of things going on there. I'm just trying to remember if there's anything in my report. If you email me, I will have a look through and I'll see if I can find something out for you. Yeah, sorry, that one's possibly not the most satisfactory answer, but
nothing on refugees.
Nothing on refugees in mine, no, it doesn't distinguish.
Libby.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, guys, for those great presentations. I'm Libby Mitchell from Motu. Just want to follow up on the move question earlier. I know, Jaimie, that you don't have information or enough information perhaps on the reason for moves, but do you know anything about moving between those housing categories from public, private, ownership and back? And then likewise, Arthur, do you know much from Simon's paper if they found positive moves from private to public housing? What if you go from public back to private, and does that have a negative effect, or do you know much more about these flows in and out of the categories?
Yeah. Yes, this is where I started actually, in terms of my kind of understanding what was happening. Unfortunately, the questions in growing up get asked a little differently each time, and so it was actually really hard to isolate how much was a change in status and a change in question answered. It's asked at the very beginning, and we were focused in on the early years and the ongoing trajectories from that. So that made, I did try running some fixed effects models to see if I could get changes that way, and that didn't really work either. So it's hard to tell with my data. But there's a lot of different reasons for moving again, and I think that's probably where the interesting part could lie, if I can get more into that. Yeah.
And on my side, no, Simon et al.'s work did not look at people moving the other way. It was very specifically, at least my memory of it, is very specifically people moving from private rentals to public rentals. Very few people would be silly enough, I think, to move from public rentals to private rentals, unless they've been evicted, for instance, as the previous question had, in which case you might find a really negative sort of sign, but that's probably spurious because of what's happened to them.
Sorry.
I would be curious if anyone out there does know any data around the moving out part of things. I'm very curious about that too.
Just a related question. You have income data, right?
Yes.
Growing up in New Zealand.
Yes.
Could you do an analysis of moves conditional on income going up versus down?
Potentially.
Just to sort of say, the hypothesis there is a positive income shock versus a negative income shock. I mean, you just have to define, anyway. Yeah. We'll have one question online, and then I know we've got some more questions in the audience.
Okay, kia ora, Yasmin from Kainga Ora here. I'm of the firm belief that housing and security of housing is a human right, and that there are two key things that need to shift dramatically: more builds and private market regulation, i.e. rental warrants fitness, rental height caps, number of homes people can own, and for what reason, i.e. not as a key source of profit for Airbnb, etc. However, I am noticing a relentless commentary on not being able to build our way out of the housing crisis in the government sector. I agree it's not the only thing to do, however, that building is certainly key when we have many, many thousands of people without secure housing. What would you say to that? I see it as a bit of a cop-out in terms of not increasing build programs or acknowledging that government is supposed to serve people and ensure human rights are met.
It's a pretty specific question.
It's a very specific question. Well, for a start, yeah, we need to build more. But we need to build more of all kinds of homes. We need to build more public housing, definitely. I mean, I think we have as I said at the start, we have a very low proportion of public housing in New Zealand. And yet, when you look at other aspects of comparing New Zealand with other countries, for instance, you look at the PISA survey in education, we have a much longer tail, at the bottom tail than we do than other countries, which suggests also that there's a greater need probably for public housing to service people in that tail than there is in the similar European countries that we see, which have much greater supply of public housing. So I'd agree with the importance of build. I also agree with the importance of things like rental warranted fitness. If we have a warranted fitness on cars, it seems which are much less important than a warranted fitness on a house, because that's where you spend 2/3 of about. You spend something like 70% of your life in your own house. In time use surveys show that. Okay, so I mean it's unbelievable how much of a proportion of our time we spend inside our own house. That's in most countries. So that's however, I would be very wary about things like height limits and all those sorts of things, or where you can rent. We need more housing. I mean, you go to any other country, people live in rental housing on the 33rd floor or 23rd floor or something like that. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. So I think you have to be very careful about the regulation, but that doesn't say we shouldn't have some.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about a system issue, it's always, and it ends up in a discussion of the A versus B. Often it is actually A and B together, and so getting the market working properly is a really great part of the picture. Alongside these, if you're thinking about what the outcomes need to be, and you can not necessarily have to build houses to get those outcomes as well. So around, I like the rental warranted fitness and tenancy protection and all these sorts of things as well. You can get some of these benefits you get in public housing as well, and so doing it all together is probably a good idea.
Yeah, very good. There were a gentleman behind. Yes.
Oh, that's not a gentleman.
Thanks for the talks. Can I ask a question of Jaimie? Your very last slide, you had the word agency on it.
Yes.
And I wonder to what extent we need to think more about how households' normal behaviour is constrained by what the landlord has decided. I mean, can you have your naughty relative while they're on bail, or are we going to carry on doubling the number of people in jail on remand? Can you look after your grandchildren when your offspring are failed parents? You know, I'm just talking about one narrow dimension in the justice area, but there must be many. And so just where do you see us going with that really challenging word?
It's been interesting because I think coming at this from an economist's perspective originally, economists are very good at talking about this agency and people moving for jobs and shifting around the place as if it's super easy, which it's not. But then also there's the other side, which is security of tenure, and I think often people in the public health space and this sort of thing are very high on this without forgetting the other. So putting them together, and then also coming from now a housing providers sort of organizational lens with Home Foundation, thinking, okay, how can we create opportunities for people to have agency in their own homes, choosing paint colors, choosing amenities around housing developments, all these sorts of things. There's so much scope for creating agency if people are thinking about that first. But yes, it is very challenging, and because it then comes into conflict with what neighbours might want in a situation. You know, there's a lot going on, but I think we need to keep talking about it, because otherwise it gets just left off to the side. Yeah.
It's a very good, I think it's related to the previous question as well around sort of vulnerabilities. And I had a chat with Arthur about this previously. So we have 2 young children. Our landlord knows that we have 2 young children and knows that they go to the local school, and we're in that zone. I think the landlord would normally capture our moving costs, right? You don't have to think very hard to think that a landlord would know that we find it hard to move and therefore charge higher rent. So thinking about who in society is faces high moving costs, and where the landlords might capture that value. Anyway, do we want to have one more questions online?
Yeah. Thanks for the stimulating presentation. I am Claire Mowat, an academic from Massey University. My question is, what are the priority strategic and political implications from your research/experience for New Zealand pursuing a wellbeing budget or agenda in the shorter and longer term?
Broad question. From the narrow aspect.
So Arthur, can you repeat the question?
You couldn't hear it, sorry. Can you just do a very brief summary of that?
Yep. What are the priority, strategic and political implications from your research/experience for New Zealand pursuing a wellbeing budget or agenda in the shorter and longer term?
Okay, so a couple of aspects. One, from a housing point of view, from my point of view, we've had a situation now going back over a century, back to the 1890s, essentially 1900, where we have successive regimes that have either favoured public housing or not favoured public housing. And especially that's been the case. The Liberals started public housing about the turn of the 20th century. Then from 1935 onwards, basically we had Labor governments that supported it, national governments that didn't support it. And it's just gone backwards and forwards there. I would love to see a much more consistent role on public housing, rather than being ramped up hugely and then cut hugely. It's just a sort of a continued build for a very long time. That's the wish list politically, who knows. From a broader point of view, a wellbeing budget. Reasons why I use wellbeing measures like the WHO5, life satisfaction, things like that, is it tells you how people rate their own lives. Okay? And if you look at the last government's wellbeing budget approach, it was just a dashboard. It was just a bunch of indicators that we've always had in the New Zealand yearbook going back for 150 years. It didn't tell us anything new over and above what was already in old yearbooks. Wellbeing, if you're going to do a wellbeing budget, you have to actually have some targets and some outcomes that you want to achieve, preferably about well-being, to achieve them. And so I think that there has to be that sort of focus on how do people rate their own lives? How are people doing, rather than just a whole bunch of figures, which is what we had.
Jaimie, did you want to add?
Just that the term wellbeing's been somewhat unhelpfully politicised as well, which makes discussion around it a little bit tricky sometimes, particularly when you're coming from an academic perspective. So anyway.
We've got time for some.
Actually, can I just come in on that? When David Cameron was going for Parliament, going for becoming PM in the UK, so Conservative thing, he ran on that we shouldn't be maximising GDP, gross domestic product, we should be maximising GWB, gross well-being. And it was in Sarkozy, the centre-right president in France, ran on well-being. It's been a centre-right policy internationally to go for a well-being approach. Here it's been politicised because a centre-left party went with it. People should just think, what's the meaning of the word? It means that people are feeling better about their lives. That's a great thing. It doesn't matter whether you're right or left. It's unfortunate it's been politicised.
Yeah, so we've got lots of hands now at the back. Sorry. So I'll give everyone a chance to ask one question, if that's all right.
Tēnā kouroa, thank you for that great presentation. A question for Arthur. I think you mentioned early on that tenants from public housing reported better outcomes on most measures except for safety. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about why that was and whether that measure declined over time. Kia ora.
I haven't got any, I've got no data on whether it declined over time. But, I think there's successive studies now. Simon Anastasiadis is one, et al. Connell's one, mine, ours, I should say. It does suggest that, public housing is concentrated in particular areas, and as we see, people with more difficulties, whether it's the parents or the children, are likely to be concentrated in those houses. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me that that's the case. It does suggest that what we need is more of these wraparound services to make sure that that when you put a whole bunch of people who are disadvantaged for various aspects of their lives for various reasons, that there's some wraparound services there to try and deal with that. It's not just enough to plonk them there and then walk away.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, and now come online. Exactly.
Hi, my name is Shahir Salman. I'm a student. Thank you for your presentations. There's been a lot of talk in news media, but also, I guess, anecdotally, you hear from word of mouth about certain tenants in public housing being or engaging in antisocial behaviour and that influencing the welfare of people who live nearby. Has that been investigated empirically in New Zealand or elsewhere? or even people's perceptions of people who live in public housing?
I'm not sure, but probably know much more than me whether there's been any studies on this. The studies that I've seen that are sort of tangential to this, they're mixed. So we see these studies that, for instance, that people feel more unsafe in the neighbourhood when there's a greater density of public housing. On the other hand, a very good study done in Christchurch showed that there was no house price discount for living near public housing. There was people paid as much for a house whether it was near public housing or not. So I think the jury's out, to be honest, on how it's affecting other people.
Makes for great news headlines though.
Just take a couple of questions online because I skipped a bit.
From Ellen Blake, what do you see as the key action that government needs to take now from Poneki Public Housing Futures?
Yes, I always struggle with this question when it's a system that needs addressing, to pick one part of the system. But I think, as I said before, it needs to take an approach that takes all of the system into account. And ideally, if it can be done in such a way that there's consistent change from one government to the next, that's when you can really embed progress. There's so much gets lost in the shift from one approach to another. Yeah, so I'd leave it at that.
Depends on whether you're looking long term or short term. Short term, I think the thing that could be done fastest and best would be to change back to the previous tenancy laws, where it's much more difficult to evict people than it is now. I think it's a huge mistake to have moved to a situation where people can evict tenants basically with very little notice. I think that can be fixed overnight. Long term, I think we need to have a greater emphasis on providing housing for the people that are otherwise going to be not only not managing well themselves, but are actually going to be a cost to others in society by having inadequate housing.
So from Stephen Moe, Chair at the Community Housing Funding Agency, I'm curious about mixed tenure, so public, private, rental and ownership. What if all types of housing are mixed in a development? Do we have any data on the impact of that, or is that still a new approach in New Zealand? If not any data, any theory on if that would affect wellbeing or human flourishing?
I've been actually starting to look at this because Home does a bunch of mixed tenure developments. I think there's actually Eleanor Chisholm's in the room today, and she's just put out a paper talking about this in terms of health outcomes and the concentration of public housing. And I think when if I've read her results right, suggesting that when there's higher numbers of people in public housing, there is actually some health benefits to do potentially with things like targeting, being able to target those most in need. I think what happens when we're looking at mixing tenures together, it's probably a lot to do with the context. And he talked about developments. It's quite different creating a little development as it is to create a policy for the nation as a whole. I think that's probably an important distinction to make as well. I'm losing my train of thought. I probably should have had lunch rather than nervously not. Did I answer that? Was there something I should have? No. Okay.
I was going to draw on Eleanor's work as well. I think when there's a very, very high concentration of public housing together, there's some negative effects by memory, but otherwise there was no negative effects, and if anything, positive. So that's the work to look at. Eleanor's sitting at the back there looking very shy. Fantastic piece.
There was some hands down here. So I had this, and what was your name? Sorry. Yeah. And then you as well.
So Jaimie, going back to the data for the public housing children, why do you think two-parent girls saw much greater improvement in wellbeing over time than two-parent boys?
I think that's probably a difference in the girls versus boys. Girls just seem to develop faster in the social emotional side of things, which was probably was just what was picked up in the graph there. Yeah.
I can confirm my 7-year-old daughter is more emotionally mature than I am. So
your sample of one is confirmed. Thank you.
High power. It's a high power. One question online.
Yeah, from Andrew Body. Are the studies measuring the situation of tenants immediately before and before and after entry into public housing, do you think that those on accommodation supplement immediately before entry are in a worse condition than those after entry into public housing?
So our study didn't look at that, but the study that Simon Anastasiadis et al. Did, the Social Investment Agency, did exactly that, and found that the people who were in private rentals immediately before going into public housing and then moved into public housing definitely benefited in multiple ways by getting a better house and becoming more satisfied with their lives, etc., as a result of that. So that is picking that up. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Vasora.
Kia ora koutou, Tim Rochford from NZNO. I have a really good idea for private rentals to improve the quality. If you gave landlords, particularly wealthy landlords, a $3.1 billion tax cut, they would immediately invest that in improving the quality of private rentals. So there's an idea. No, I was actually going to ask about the data, because one of the things that was curious to me was the very linear way in which children's experiences were around both moving and other things. And I'm wondering whether you were able to ascertain the impact of family breakups in that, because that's likely to be much more negative.
Yes, definitely. This is something was on the list of things I would really like to get into. The international literature definitely shows that that's one of the big things. And it's also something that's not really in our discussion much around housing in New Zealand, because every time a family splits in half, we now require 2 houses for that single family. It's at a macro level, it's hard, in a policy level, it's hard to sort of focus policies in on this, but I think it should be part of the discussion. Yeah.
Sorry, just one other thing, homelessness.
Yep.
Are we able to ascertain what the level of homelessness in the country is, what the impact that has on?
Well, in the Growing Up in New Zealand study, so between the 8-year and 12-year wave, they asked whether the children had a period of being without a home, and 1 in 7 children had. And that kind of floored me, particularly knowing the attrition from the study, because it's the families that are to even be in a longitudinal study after 12 years, and that still 1 in 7 of them were having these periods of homelessness, was quite shocking. So there's a lot of sort of going to stay with auntie for a while. There's a lot, all this kind of making it work that happens. Yeah.
Can I just come in one point there? That homelessness, it's the reason why we need a census.
Yeah.
Okay? Because you're not going to pick it up from administrative data and things like that. The Stats New Zealand has done a fantastic job over the last 2 censuses, despite the last, the criticisms of actually going out and sitting with homeless people on the street on census week, and helping them to fill out their forms and do this sort of thing. It's really important. And, I'm not too fussed whether it's every 5 years or 10 years, but boy, do we need a census. And the idea of scrapping it is just bizarre, to be honest.
We have time for one more online question, Emma, and then we might have to call it quits. But like I mentioned, if you have follow-up questions, please keep sending them through, because we want to hear your ideas and know what you're interested in.
I think this might be more of a statement, but there's no other one.
Okay.
No, don't worry.
No, we'll leave it. Yeah. No, we'll call it quits if it's not a question. Then. Okay. Yeah. That's the rule. I'm sorry, I make the rules. I'd just like to thank everyone. Firstly, our 2 speakers, if we could give them a round of applause. Wow, wonderful audience and excellent questions. And I'd like to thank Emma for organising and doing so much work. So thank you very much. Please help yourself. I think there's some food left and drinks. And if you didn't get to ask a question, you can barrel these guys up now afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Profile of social housing. And sometimes you can just say, here's what I think. It's a nice idea. Is there I just want to, when you look at that.
I wasn't speaking to clearly enough. The mic was a bit flaky. That guy over there.
So I think it probably I'll leave it to
Oh, okay.
Are you just got a conversation with that and then you're done?
Yes, I'm just
going to